The road to the nameless city, lost among ancient forests, always brought strange thoughts. Mark kept his hands on the steering wheel, gripping it tighter than usual, as if something made him stay alert. The sky, once blue and clear, was now covered by a dense veil of clouds, foreshadowing a storm that seemed to have started long ago, but could never truly erupt. The dark shadows of trees stretching along the road appeared endless. Mark had come here for work, a journalistic assignment that seemed routine at first glance. The local psychiatric hospital, shrouded in mysterious stories, had been a source of intrigue for those hungry for sensationalism. He himself wouldn't mind if the material turned out to be successful. However, the hospital, known as the Abyssal Depths as the locals called it, had such a grim reputation that Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this journey would change his life forever. As he approached the hospital, he saw massive iron gates. They looked as though they hadn't been opened for centuries, overgrown with ivy and warped by time. The inscription on the sign was almost worn away, but he could still make out the letters, Scholl's Psychiatric Institute. Mark parked the car and got out. The cold wind immediately bit at his face. He felt that the hospital emanated a quiet horror, something better left unspoken. Not expecting to see a guard, he nonetheless stepped forward, heading toward the entrance. The building's windows, dark and lifeless, seemed to be watching him. He didn't know where this sensation came from, but it grew stronger with each passing moment. Mark Gromov, journalist, he muttered as he approached the doors, but the only response was silence. He pushed the doors, and they creaked open, revealing a massive lobby. The air smelled of dampness and decay. A faint scent of rot mingled with the musty atmosphere. Right in front of him was a reception desk, behind which sat a man in a white coat, who, upon Mark's arrival, slightly raised his head. "Welcome," the man said in a hollow voice. "Are you here by appointment?" Mark nodded and walked inside, looking around. The hospital was oppressively silent. No sounds, no movement. Empty corridors stretched out in every direction, turning into a labyrinth of rooms and offices. The whole place had the feeling of time frozen long ago. There were no patients, no nurses, but everything seemed as though someone still lived here. "I'm here for an interview with Dr. Scholl," Mark said as he approached the reception desk. "Dr. Scholl is expecting you," the receptionist replied, his voice sounding strangely detached, as if he were present in body, but his mind had long left this place. Mark proceeded further as directed, descending through dark corridors. The lighting was dim. At times it seemed as though the lamps barely emitted any light. Passing by another closed office, Mark heard a rustling behind the door. He stopped, listening. The sound disappeared after a moment, but something in this place made his heart race faster. He pulled himself together and continued, though the sense of danger never left him. When he finally reached Dr. Scholl's office, the door was slightly ajar. He knocked gently and stepped inside. Dr. Scholl was sitting at his desk, intently examining some papers. When Mark entered, he raised his eyes. "You must be Mark," he said, pointing to the chair opposite him. "Please sit." Mark smiled stiffly and sat down. Dr. Scholl looked like he was already in his 70s. His gaunt face was etched with deep wrinkles, and his eyes glinted with a strange, icy gleam. When he spoke, his voice was confident, but there was an underlying tone that was unsettling. "I'm sure you've heard a lot about our institution," he began. "Studying Mark, the Abyssal Depths is not just a psychiatric hospital. It's a place where the boundaries of the human mind are studied." Mark couldn't take his eyes off the old man, listening to his every word. He noticed how the doctor's fingers nervously played with the edges of the paper. The feeling of tension, of hidden danger grew stronger. "But you've come here for something more than just a story, haven't you?" Scholl suddenly asked, leaning toward him. "I know what really drew you here, the stories of monsters." Mark flinched slightly. He had heard the locals speak about the monsters in the hospital in great detail, phantom figures whispering at night, strange patients who disappeared without a trace, but it all seemed like fiction. Until this moment. "Monsters?" Mark cautiously asked. "I was hoping you could explain what people mean by that." "Ah, monsters," Scholl smirked. "They are merely images, reflections of our fears, our deepest desires. But sometimes these images become reality." There was a hint of madness in his voice. A cold shiver ran down Mark's spine. He realized the old man was talking about something far more terrifying than just patients with psychiatric disorders. "And if you want to know the truth," Scholl continued quietly, "you must descend to the lower floors. There, you will find the answers. Or lose yourself." The doctor's words sounded like both a warning and a challenge. Mark understood that perhaps the answer lay deeper, beneath the hospital, in its ancient, forgotten corridors. He stood up, nodded to the doctor, and made his way out. As he descended into the basement, he felt the surrounding space constricting. Down here, everything was different. The walls were damp, the air heavy and thick, as if the space itself was trying to swallow him. Mark wandered through the winding corridors for a long time, but soon noticed a door leading to an old elevator. The elevator was rusty, and the down button looked like it hadn't been pressed in decades. Nonetheless, Mark decided to continue. The cabin jolted and began its slow descent. When the doors finally opened, he found himself in a massive underground hall. All around were hundreds of closed cages, but none of them were empty. Inside each of these cages, something moved, something alive but alien. Creatures resembling humans but twisted, as if from a nightmare. Their eyes were full of pain and hatred. But this was only the beginning. In the center of the hall stood an altar, surrounded by strange symbols. On it, chained, lay a man. Mark approached closer and froze in horror. The man bound to the altar was himself. His doppelganger, emaciated and covered in scars, opened his eyes and spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered. "It's a trap. They were waiting for you." Mark recoiled, unable to believe what he was seeing. His head spun, and shadows blurred his vision. But one thing became clear: he was now part of this nightmare. He would never leave this place.